You're fired.
Hello, America. Judge Andrew Napolitano here in for Glenn Beck tonight. The budget cut that wasn't. When you cut a budget in the real world, it means you spend less than you did previously. But in Washington, a long way from reality, you can spend more this year than you did last year and still call it a cut, so long as you cut $38 billion from what the president originally wanted to spend. What's absurd is that some Republicans, like House Speaker John Boehner, are championing this deal as a big budget cut, while big government-loving liberals are attacking the deal as a blow to their beloved social spending programs. How are both sides so blind to the fiscal reality? It's not a cut. It's a shell game. The government is spending billions more this year in 2011 than it did last year in 2010, and it's borrowing $1 trillion between now and October just to make ends meet. And while the Congress can't find a way to make real cuts, its members are gearing up to vote yes on raising the debt ceiling. It seems the Congress only knows how to borrow and spend money more each year and not how to cut and spend. Freshman Congressman Justin Amash from Michigan joins me now. Congressman Amash, welcome to the Glenn Beck program.
Thanks for having me on, Judge.
Of course. Why can't the president operate the government without borrowing more money than he collects in taxes and other revenue?
Well, we have a people who become too dependent on welfare, too dependent on spending. We have a military budget that continues to grow, and we have an entitlement problem in this country. Our Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are growing out of control, and we need to reform that for the generations coming up, or we're not going to be able to sustain this country.
Now, when the Democrats controlled the Congress last year, both houses of Congress, they were unable to come up with a budget for this full year, which is why we're 4 months into 2011, but 6 months into the fiscal year, and we don't have a budget for the rest of the year. Each time one of these continuing resolutions has come up, 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there, 5 days there, you have voted against them. I suspect it's because you believe that this is no way to run any kind of a business, much less the largest in the world, the federal government of the United States. What do your fellow Republicans say to you when you keep voting against these efforts to kick the can down the road?
Well, there appears to be a difference in strategy. A lot of my colleagues believe that the strategy is to make the big battle over the debt ceiling, over the 2012 budget. I think we need to fight right now, and that's what I'm doing. The cuts we've seen so far have been tiny. We have this $38 billion deal that supposedly is the largest cut in the history of the country, and during the time we're debating this deal, the deficit increased enough to make up for the cuts.
Right.
I mean, it surpasses the cuts that we made just in the time we negotiated it.
Congressman, I don't think that this is a cut at all. This is really a reduction from what the president planned to spend. This is not any actual savings. In order for the government to do what Congressman Boehner and the president and Senator Reid have agreed to do, it's got to borrow another $1 trillion between now, mid-April, and the end of September, just to make all those payments. How could anybody, except perhaps in Washington, call that a cut or a savings?
That's right. Every year the president proposes a budget. If we come in under that budget, we call it a cut. And that's frankly insane. If the president proposes a $4 trillion budget and we come in a trillion short, that's not a cut. We need to have real cuts from what spending has been in the past.
You are serious about wanting to cut the budget. You're serious about wanting to compel the president to operate the government without any borrowing. Not all of your colleagues are, but some of them have said to my colleagues and me here at Fox and elsewhere, particularly Republicans, particularly conservative Republicans, that they will not vote to raise the debt ceiling unless, and then it changes, unless the president cuts a deal, unless we get a balanced budget amendment. Is there any unless that you would go for, or are you hard and fast that the government borrowing must stop now, and the president's job is to run the government on the basis of the revenue he collects with zero borrowing?
Well, I think it's very unlikely that we can get any sort of deal that would, for example, repeal the health care legislation or introduce a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. If those kind of things don't happen, then of course I can't support any increase in the debt ceiling.
Is there any chance that the House of Representatives will not vote to increase the debt ceiling? Because this is a change in the law, raising the debt ceiling, technically authorizing the Treasury Department to go out and borrow more money. And for a change in the law, of course, both houses have to agree, and then the president has to sign on to it. But if every Republican in the House, or if 3/4 of the Republicans in the House voted against this, that's the end of it. It doesn't even go to the Senate. There is no more borrowing, and the president is forced to do what he never thought he'd have to do, operate the government just on the basis of the revenues he collects. What are the chances, Congressman Amash, of that happening in the next couple of weeks?
I think there's a strong chance. There are a lot of conservative Republicans who have been elected who are not willing to raise the debt ceiling. And we've heard all this hype about the government defaulting. The government will not default if the debt ceiling is not raised. All we'll have to do is cut some spending to live within our means. If we do that, we'll be just fine.
How do you address the complaints of Democrats who say grandma's going to starve, and Junior won't have his school bus, and the other kids won't get their Pell Grants, their scholarships for college? Stated differently, how would you address the sort of social welfare things that the federal government does, which you and I believe are nowhere authorized under the Constitution, but which it has been doing, and on which people have been relying since Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House?
Well, we need to return our federal government to what it was originally intended to do, to defend the country, to defend Americans so that we can live freely here, defend our borders, and leave things like welfare programs and other programs to the states and to local governments, and preferably to private industry.
Got it. Congressman Justin Amash, Republican of Michigan, standing firm on the Constitution. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Judge. And please check out my Facebook page, facebook.com/Rep. Justin Amash.
You got it. Here with me now, the ranking member on the Senate Budget Committee, Alabama Republican Senator Jeff Sessions. Senator Sessions, we understand you just ran out of a committee meeting, and we're deeply grateful for accommodating our schedule. And even though it's Judge Napolitano, welcome to the Glenn Beck program.
Thank you, Judge.
What did you think of the deal that was cut by the White House and the House Republican leadership and Senator Harry Reid? Is this something you can vote for, or is this just, in your view, as it is in mine, cosmetic?
Judge, I think it's pretty significant, and I'm going to vote for it. It represents about 2/3 of what the Republicans asked for, and it's a savings in 1/2 of the fiscal year between now and September 30th. And as has been said, we got to have a real serious discussion about the next fiscal year's budget and what kind of reforms we have to insist on as part of any kind of debt limit increase.
All right. Now, that discussion will come in the next couple of weeks because, as you know, the Treasury is perilously close, or from the point of view of fiscal hawks, happily close to the limit of its legal ability to borrow. Stated differently, in about 2 or 3 weeks, the president will come to the Congress and say, I want to borrow another $1 trillion and I need the authority to do it. Will Jeff Sessions from Alabama vote to let the president continue borrowing and digging deeper that $14.3 trillion abyss that we're standing on the edge of?
Well, I would just say it this way. The American people are saying to their children in Washington, get real, get this debt under control, and we've got to make fundamental changes. We have overspent our credit card much quicker than we ever thought would happen. The debts are so much larger than we projected just a few years ago.
Right.
So we've got a very serious national crisis that we need to confront, put ourselves on a road to prosperity instead of a debt crisis. And, excuse me, so I'd like to see what kind of reforms are possible. And I think that this president thinks he can just waltz in and say, take it or leave it. If you don't give us a clean debt limit increase, we're going to blame you with shutting down the government or not paying our debts. I think he's sadly mistaken.
All right, we just had some interesting numbers up on the screen with which I think you're no doubt familiar. In February of 2011, the government borrowed $232 billion. That's more than it's ever borrowed in any other month. In March of 2011, it borrowed $188 billion. In the first half of this fiscal year, $829 billion. Do you think there's any way, Senator Sessions, that the president can be stopped that the executive branch can be stopped from this borrowing without the Congress saying you don't have the legal authority to do it? Is there any promise he could make to you that you would rely on that would induce you to let him go out and do this kind of borrowing again?
Well, it's it's a good question. I think Congress ultimately, as you know, Judge, has the power of the purse. We don't have to spend a dime. We don't have to give the president authority to spend any money. So Congress needs to assert itself. We've just got the difficulty in the Senate, which is one half of the process, not being willing to make any tough cuts. And one of the more amazing things, unappreciated, is the fact that in the State of the Union, in his budget, the president has not even begun to discuss the serious threat this nation faces, as his own debt commission has told him we do. So we're trying to fight a battle for the future of America with the president on the sidelines.
Last question, Senator Sessions. Tomorrow afternoon, when the president addresses the nation, I can't even say this with a straight face, he's going to ask for tax increases in the midst of the worst recession in modern times. How will that set with Republicans on Capitol Hill?
I don't think it's going to set well at all. This is a spending problem, not a problem that the American people don't send enough money to Washington. That's not the problem. The problem is spending, spending, spending. It's surged out of control, and we can get it under control. It's not going to be easy. The hole we're in today is much deeper than it was in '95 when we balanced the budget in 3 or 4 years. It's a deeper hole that requires more sustained, serious, mature effort and focus, and the president is basically been saying, don't worry, I've submitted a budget that lives within our means, that pays down our debt, which has been shown to be utterly false.
Senator Jeff Sessions from Alabama, thanks very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
The White House today warned Congress not to hold the vote on the debt ceiling hostage. Press Secretary Jay Carney had this to say.
A game of chicken with our economy is a hugely risky affair that will not just be a game of who wins and who loses in the political sweepstakes here in Washington, but will have a catastrophic and direct impact on economies around the world and on Americans here.
A game of chicken, he calls it. Meanwhile, House Speaker John Boehner says his party, the Republicans, will not vote to raise the limit unless serious changes are made. Earlier today, he called on the president to demonstrate leadership. Are we headed for another budget battle over this time over the debt ceiling? Arizona Republican Representative Jeff Flake, a fiscal hawk, a fiscal conservative, joins me from Capitol Hill. Representative Flake, it's a pleasure. Welcome to the Glenn Beck program. How do you see this playing out? Do you see the deal that was cut by the president and Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Reid as being adopted on this Friday, and then the battleground becoming the debt ceiling? Or do you think that enough small government, fiscally conservative Republicans will say $38 billion, that's nothing. We borrowed $100 billion during the time we were debating over the $38 billion, and not enough of them will even vote for that?
Well, I can tell you, as you mentioned, more was borrowed during the time it took to negotiate the package than we actually saved. And so we've got to use the debt limit increase as leverage to actually put a cap on spending. Spending cuts are fine, but we can see that the White House is unwilling to agree to many of those or to significant cuts at all. So what we need are enforceable spending caps. So when Congress fails to hit the spending reduction targets, there are automatic rescissions that take place across the board. And so that's what we've got to have, and a number of us will not vote for the debt limit increase unless those are attached.
Congressman Flake, do you trust the President of the United States or the Secretary of the Treasury to abide by these caps? Wouldn't it only be the power of the law that says you cannot borrow more than $14.3 trillion that would force them to run the government just with the money they collect from taxes and other revenue?
Well, the beauty of our system, Article 1 gives Congress the power of the purse, so the president can't spend any money that we don't give him. It's difficult right now because the Democrats control the Senate, and they don't seem much more inclined to cut spending than the president does. But if Congress doesn't give the president the money, he can't spend it. And if we have our own rules which prohibit us from actually spending that money, automatic rescissions that take place. That's the way to solve the problem.
Do you accept the argument of your colleague in the Senate, Pat Toomey, who was an economist before he became the senator from Pennsylvania, that the government does collect enough in revenue and taxes to pay the debt service and to run the government at the same time? Or do you accept this doomsday argument that we just heard from Jay Carney, the president's press secretary, that if you don't let the president borrow more money, we're going to default on our debt, and that will cause all kinds of Armageddon in the economic communities?
Well, I think all of us recognize when you run up bills, you've got to pay them. And the debt limit increase is basically paying off bills that we've already accrued. So I'm not disputing the fact that we need to raise the debt limit, but what I'm saying, it would be very irresponsible of Congress to, when you pay off those debts, just allow it to continue and go and go and go and do this again and again and again. The president, remember, the budget that he presented would double the national debt in just a few years. And so we can't go that direction. If we're going to raise the debt limit, then attach enforceable spending caps to it, and that's what we've got to do.
If the president doesn't attach enforceable spending caps, if the Congress doesn't enact a balanced budget resolution, will Congressman Jeff Flake of the state of Arizona vote against raising the debt ceiling?
I can tell you, unless we have enforceable spending caps, and that'll be the Congress that does that, not the president. Unless the Congress enacts enforceable spending caps, then it won't get my vote.
You see, here's the difficulty with that, and we have less than a minute. I could see the House doing that, but I can't see the Senate doing that because it's controlled by the Democrats. They, as you pointed out, want to spend. The only thing the House can do on its own is say no to more borrowing, and without an affirmative vote from the House, that legislation wouldn't even make its way to the Senate.
Well, I think the nice thing is people across the country recognize that we can't go on like this, and so I think that they'll insist, along with the House, that we have enforceable spending caps. So that's I think the strength of our position is people across the country agree with us. They
Right.
recognize we can't go on like this, and so I think we're in a strong position here in the House.
Congressman Jeff Flake, maybe in a year and a half, Senator Jeff Flake, it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Round one of the budget battle is over. A new poll indicates President Obama's party is losing support from independents when it comes to handling the federal government. The Pew survey shows they overwhelmingly prefer Republicans over Democrats when it comes to managing the finances of the federal government. Will Democrats be able to win back these independents before 2012? Here to discuss, Doug Schoen, former advisor to President Clinton, Democratic pollster, Fox News contributor, and my colleague. Doug, it's a pleasure.
Thanks,
welcome
Judge.
here. Last Friday night, an hour before midnight, the president, Harry Reid, John Boehner, none of them thrilled, but all of them happy. There was no showdown, each pointing fingers at the other two. Who won, who lost?
Well, Boehner and the Republicans are the big winner. Barack Obama dodged a bullet, metaphorically, because
Right.
if the government had shut down, it would have been calamitous.
Well, how would it have been calamitous? Politically for him?
Politically for him, he would have looked weak and impotent, and in terms of the spending, he would have looked like he had no control over the federal budget.
Are you surprised at the numbers we just had on the board, the Pew Research numbers that showed independents of all people who really put him in the White House? He obviously had all the Democrats. This is independents.
Right.
They prefer Republicans 47%, Democrats 28%, not sure,
Right.
24%. More than half of them
Right.
don't want the president.
Right.
Could he win if the vote were tomorrow and the independents voted as they told the pollsters they would vote?
Wouldn't win, and the reason he's got to make the speech he's going to do tomorrow is he's concluded, I think, that unless he comes up with a meaningful, balanced budget plan, he's not going to get reelected. This is ultimately about his survival.
But do you really think that a very, very liberal Democrat, whom I've described as halfway to socialism, I know you don't accept that, but you understand how people feel that way, would come up with a balanced budget, a budget where he didn't have to borrow any money? He borrows money like no president in history.
I understand. And the real question is, will he embrace something I support and most centrist Democrats support, which is the Bowles-Simpson plan? Two-thirds spending cuts, one-third tax increases. Unclear what the tax increases would be, but 2-to-1 spending cuts over
This
taxes.
is the so-called debt commission.
That's correct.
Which he appointed,
Correct.
which he cajoled a little bit, and then the results of which he pretty much ignored.
And ran away from, yeah.
All right. Does he gain anything if tomorrow, he says, when he addresses the nation, I want to raise taxes on people who make more than $200,000 and $250,000. This is the same president who 4 months ago signed into law an extension of the Bush-era tax rates.
Judge, the part of this that doesn't make any sense is you've had 3 Republicans, Saxby Chambliss, Mike Crapo, and I'm drawing
Tom Coburn.
And Tom Coburn.
You're talking about the Gang of Six.
Right. The Republicans have all said they'll countenance tax increases, but they're not going to go for taxes on the wealthy. The Democratic base wants it, but the mainstream doesn't. The president has buried his own story before he's gotten his plan out.
So is this speech tomorrow just to energize the Democratic base? Stated differently, does the president of the United States have a problem with the left wing of his own party?
He's got 2 problems. Scott Rasmussen's polling shows that the base is moving away precipitously. And in the center, as the Pew numbers showed, the president is down to about a quarter of the independents supporting his fiscal policies. So he's trying to bridge the gap with a plan that who knows what it's going to ultimately say.
Does he face a political threat from the left wing of his party? Meaning, could an incumbent president, for the first time since, I think, Jimmy Carter, be forced to run in primaries in his own party just to assure himself the renomination for the presidency?
I don't think he's going to have a primary, but I do think he's going to have trouble rallying a heretofore compliant liberal base. That really is an issue. The larger issue, Judge, is the American people get what you've been saying. Whether you agree or disagree with some of the specific points you made, bottom line, unless there is fiscal discipline reigning in the debt and the deficit, we're not going to reelect the president, and we're not going to carry on as a nation as we are. The American people understand it. That's why Obama's giving the speech.
Would you advise him to give that speech tomorrow in which he's going to talk about raising taxes on the so-called rich, which he characterizes as people making more than $200,000 a year?
Raising taxes on the rich? No, not after the deal. Balanced budget, reining in the debt and the deficit. He's got to do it. It's essential.
Doug Schoen, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us. President Obama set to unveil his plan to tackle our $14 trillion deficit. How will his ideas stack up against the Republican proposal? My colleague Lou Dobbs weighs in on that. Next. Anticipation over the president's major speech tomorrow is now running rampant. His blueprint to reduce the deficit is sure to hit some hot topics, from entitlements to taxes. Joining me now with more on what we can expect is Lou Dobbs. Lou, of course, is the host of Lou Dobbs Tonight on the Fox Business Network. Lou, it's a pleasure.
Great to be with you, Judge.
What will Lou Dobbs's reaction be if the same president who just signed into law an extension of the Bush-era tax rates now says he wants to raise taxes on everybody who makes more than $200,000 because he thinks that's a way to collect revenue and gin up the economy in a recession? I know it's a loaded question, but I want your answer.
I can give it to you rather quickly. It's such a nifty idea. I think I can respond to it rather quickly. I think anyone, whether it be this president or anyone in either party, who condones raising taxes, and at this stage in our economy, at this stage in this nation's challenges, is frankly just doesn't get it, and has to understand we're not about raising taxes right now. This is about reducing government, reducing government spending, and if that can't be made more clear, I don't know what it would require.
Would you expect to hear from this president, whose every personal values and political instincts are hard left, big government, central planning?
You mean he's not a centrist?
To talk
wait a minute, you're
I said central, not centrist. to talk about less spending? I mean, wouldn't he pretty much isolate the left wing of his party? He almost did the other night by a measly $38 billion cut in a $2 trillion budget.
Well, I come to this, Judge, with a little different perspective. I believe the left is already isolated. To put this in language the president is so fond of using, I believe the left is on the wrong side of history here. And I believe a president who wants to raise taxes, who is a statist, who pretends to or presumes to be called a centrist, when his policies are so clearly not centrist in any form or moderate in any fashion, is an absurdity.
Tell me what you think is on his mind. It's April 2011. In November of 2012, he may face a formidable foe. He may face a very angry electorate. Doug Schoen,
or another kind.
Right. Doug Schoen, who sat here before you, points out that independents are leaving him in droves.
Right.
Is his eye on the ball of somehow improving the economy, even if it's cosmetic and short-lived, or is his eye on the ball of getting reelected and shoring up his base?
Well, he has done this. He has created his headquarters in Chicago. He's moved his best political minds to Chicago, and they are apparently not counseling this president right now. And it seems to me that there's no question he's about re-election right now. This president has had so many great opportunities, Judge, to stand up and stand out. He could have as easily in February, when he introduced version 1 of his 2012 budget proposal, have met the challenge and said, we're going to reduce government, we're going to constrain spending, we're going to be modest in our foreign policy, we are going to return to traditional values here. And he could have preserved many of his, as you put it, central government command ideas, even at that.
But you know this better than I. He has borrowed $2 trillion in the first 2 years he's been in office. He wants to borrow another $1 trillion in the next 6 months. Then he wants to borrow $1.7 trillion in the following year. Could anybody take him seriously if he says he wants to cut the budget and balance it and pay back the debt?
Well, he wouldn't be the first president to say one thing and do the other, would he? But I believe that he did have a chance for redemption, and that's a bit of what I'm saying to you. President Obama has and had, and I don't know what he will make of it tomorrow, but it's pretty clear he's going to call for another round of tax increases. He's had such an opportunity to stand up here. He could have been that centrist that his political strategists were trying to posture him as.
I don't think he could be the centrist. I think his every instinct is towards the FDR end of the federal government. In your face, making personal choices for you, and planning the economy.
Oh, I think by no question, ideological DNA, you're quite right. But the events presented him with an opportunity, which the political animal within him could have responded to.
I don't think you've seen the speech. I know if you had, you'd share it with me. But you sound as though, I'm kidding, of course, but you sound as though you don't expect him to do the right thing tomorrow. You sound as though on Lou Dobbs tonight, tomorrow night, you're going to be angry.
I'm beyond being disappointed, I'll put it that way, in this president and in the direction that he wants to lead the nation right now. I would love to be able to tomorrow night be just as delighted, surprised, and thrilled as millions of Americans at what the president is going to say. But when we're told initially that it's going to be a form of Bull Simpson, that it's going to call for tax increases, this is not the stuff that's going to rally the American spirit.
Got it. Lou, very much. You can catch Lou, more of Lou Dobbs on his new program, Lou Dobbs Tonight. That's on the Fox Business Network every weeknight at 7 p.m. Eastern. Check him out tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern. Lou, thank you very much.
Thanks, Judge.
How President Obama's illegal and unconstitutional drone attacks in Pakistan are coming back to haunt the anti-war turned pro-war president. That's next. New request from Pakistan. The country wants the U.S. to scale down the drone attacks that have more than doubled since President Obama took office. Tonight, we want to talk about the president's use of military power. He's authorized a campaign in Libya without consulting Congress. Yet in 2007, candidate Obama told the Boston Globe, quote, "The president does not have power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation." Close quote. One might argue that Libya does not pose an imminent threat to our nation right now. Joining us with their thoughts on these and similar subjects, Carolyn Heldman, an associate professor of political science at Occidental College, and Nick Gillespie, who is the editor-in-chief of Reason TV and Reason.com, and regular colleagues of mine on the Fox News Channel and the Fox Business Network. Nick, to you first. Is there any dispute but that the president can't start a war on his own when the object of his war has not attacked us, has not threatened us, and isn't even arguably a threat to us?
Right. No, there absolutely isn't. And the only thing good that we can say about this is that it removes every last shred of doubt, or it should, among sentient beings, that Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, are exactly the same when it comes to expansive executive power. They say the same thing when they're out of power. They say the president must be curtailed and constrained, and when they get into power, they look the other way. This is an atrocious but totally expected development in Obama's presidency.
I have a sneaking suspicion that your colleague, though a faculty member at a major university and a self-proclaimed liberal Democrat, Carolyn Heldman, agrees with Nick Gillespie on this one. Am I right?
Absolutely, Judge. I've studied the presidency, and anyone who studies the presidency knows that the Constitution does not authorize a president to go to war. It's only Congress. And the War Powers Resolution of 1973, as you pointed out, only authorizes the president to use force for 60 days if American lives, property, or U.S. soil is being threatened. That's not the case in Libya. I support the president's libertarian, humanitarian efforts to emancipate the rebels, but he has to do it through Congress. And this expansion of presidential power didn't start with him. It started many decades ago,
right.
And I would agree with Nick. This is expected at this point.
Nick, here's what gets me, and Carolyn, you can jump in on this. Feel free to. What really burns me is the Congress looking the other way. I mean, here he waited for Congress to be on spring break. Forgive me, Carolyn. I thought only colleges got spring break, but we know that Congress gets a spring break, too. He waits until he's in Brazil. He thumbs his nose at the Congress by getting permission of the Arab League, which is a bunch of dictators in Cairo, NATO, which is a bunch of social democrats in Belgium, and the pointy heads that run the Security Council of the UN not far from here. Why didn't Congress, the week it returned, take to the floor and demand an answer from the president or enact legislation demanding a return of the troops on the plains? Nick Gillespie.
Well, you know, this is actually one of the key problems. I mean, we focus on the executive presidency or the imperial presidency because it's a single person, it's easy to understand, and it's a series of villains going back to, you know, somebody like Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt or George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, you know, who all contravene the Constitution in pursuit of their particular administration's goals. What is galling in the long run is that the Congress, which has the constitutional right and responsibility to declare war, has constantly gone missing in these types of things, where even the authorization of force, you know, in Iraq, you know, how did that, the second time around, how did that pass with more unanimity or near unanimity than the first Persian Gulf War? It's because Congress is filled with a bunch of total lily-livered sapsuckers who, you know, they might say that they belong to the red party or the blue party. It's the yellow stripe down their back that's the real issue here.
All right, when we come back, Carolyn, I'm going to start with you and ask if we have two parties or we just have one party in the government called the War Party. More with our panel after this. Carolyn, why does it seem that everybody in the government, except for Dennis Kucinich liberals and Ron Paul libertarians, seems to like war?
Well, I think that it's difficult to go against public opinion. I actually place the blame in the hands of the American public. We don't have constitutional literacy, and with the rise of mass media, we have given the president an inordinate amount of power to persuade us. And so I think it's very hard for Congress, which has been called the broken branch, to really stand against the president when he wants to push war measures through.
Nick Gillespie, the other night I asked that question to Charlie Rangel, the famously liberal, somewhat outrageous congressman from Harlem for the past 40 years. And he looked at me and he said, I won't imitate his voice, we like Barack Obama and we like all the other things he's done, so we're going to sort of let him get away with this one, and we can't stand Muammar Gaddafi. I mean, that is not an intellectually sound, legally acceptable, or constitutionally based reason for war.
No, it certainly isn't. And, you know, there's no question that the war fever goes back as far as human history. I mean, people, unfortunately, like war, and governments play to that all the time. I think it's true that we should have constitutional literacy, but, you know, these congressmen are not, you know, they're not cripples. They're not blind. They're not deaf. They're not lead-poisoned children or something. These are people who are paid to uphold the Constitution, and they ought to start doing it, or we ought to start voting more of them out next time around.
Carolyn, do you understand that people will give a president a pass because the target of the military is someone who is so hated as Muammar Gaddafi? Or would it be better that they stuck to the Constitution, lest this become a precedent for a future president to follow?
Well, I think it has become precedent, and that's a problem. And I think that it's a problem anytime you get away from the Constitution. But unfortunately, we do rally around the flag. We give the president carte blanche during times of crisis. And so if he says it's a crisis, then we tend to rally behind him, or hopefully at some point her. And that's a really big problem when it comes to how our country is supposed to function.
It is a really big problem, and I think that every major president in modern times has done this, has expanded the power of the imperial presidency at the expense of the legislative branch. Carolyn Heldman, Nick Gillespie, thank you very much for joining us. My final thoughts on all of this, especially the budget, after this. Does the government work for us, or do we work for the government? Would you hire an employee who claimed he was saving you $38 billion when in reality he was costing you more money than in the previous year of your business, and you still needed to borrow $1 trillion just to stay afloat? You know what's coming tonight. The federal government and your money. Here we go again. I know this sounds ridiculous, but you should not be surprised. Shortly before midnight last Friday, President Obama, House of Representatives Speaker John Boehner, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid announced that the White House and the Congress had reached a stunning deal on cutting the federal government budget by $38 billion. The president grumbled that the cuts were too deep, but he could live with them. Speaker Boehner grumbled that the cuts were not deep enough, but were better than what he originally sought. Senator Reid dispatched his favorite attack dog, that would be the personality-challenged New York Senator Chuck Schumer, to threaten that the Democrats would cut no longer, since the Republicans were controlled by extremists. That's the same Senator Schumer who revealed in a telephone call with reporters that he didn't know was being taped that the Senate Democratic Caucus, which is all of the Senate Democrats, had instructed him to refer to Tea Party Republicans as extremists. The begrudging joint announcement that a government shutdown had been averted came as a surprise at the last minute. And conventional wisdom has it that when you settle a dispute like this and each side is unhappy, you probably did a good job. But there's nothing conventional about this agreement. First, a little background. According to the Constitution and federal law and a 230-year-old tradition, the president proposes a budget sufficiently in advance of the fiscal year in which he wants to spend the money, and the House of Representatives approves, modifies, or disapproves. Then whatever the House has voted on goes to the Senate, then back to the House, then to the president for his signature. The process is supposed to produce a budget months in advance of the fiscal year, so that federal agencies, so that people who sell things to the government, so that the financial community will have time to prepare for what the government will spend. There is currently before the Congress two budget proposals. One is for the remainder of this fiscal year, which ends on September 30th, 2011. And the other is a budget for the fiscal year that begins the next day on October 1st. As you can see, the government is woefully late for the 2011 budget, since we are halfway through that fiscal year. It is for the remainder of this 2011 fiscal year that the so-called deal that cut $38 billion was struck. So, what did they cut $38 billion from? They cut it from what the president wanted to spend, and he wanted to spend far more in 2011 than he did spend in 2010. Thus, even with the so-called cut, spending for the remainder of 2011 will increase, not decrease. As Senator Rand Paul told me on this show last night, only in Washington can a budget that spends more than it did the year before and with a larger deficit be portrayed as cutting. He's right. And the Republicans who boasted that they cut $38 billion and the Democrats who condemned them for doing so are all playing a shell game. America, we are at the precipice of a very deep abyss. It is an enormous hole that needs to be filled with $14.3 trillion. And the president just wants to dig that hole deeper. Since Barack Obama became president, he has increased the debt by $4 trillion. In the next 6 months, he wants to increase the debt by another trillion. And in the 2012 fiscal year, he wants to borrow another $1.7 trillion. America, the White House, and its enablers in Congress are out of control. They have tricked even well-intentioned folks into believing that the economy will collapse if we don't borrow more. That's nonsense. The economy will tank if we do borrow more. It is utterly immoral, illegal, and unconstitutional for the government to borrow when it has neither the intention nor the means to repay the loan. Let me modify that. The government does repay its loans. It just does it with more loans. Would you hire people who run the federal government to run your business or your household or even your checkbook? The answer is obvious, and that leaves another obvious question. Why are these people running the government? Tonight on Freedom Watch at 8 p.m. Eastern on the Fox Business Network, I will go toe-to-toe with Bill Kristol on the president's warmongering in Libya. From New York, my friends, defending freedom. So long, America. Between now, mid-April, and the end of September, just to make all those payments. How could anybody, except perhaps in Washington, call that a cut or a savings?
That's right. Every year, the president proposes a budget. If we come in under that budget, we call it a cut. And that's frankly insane. If the president proposes a $4 trillion budget and we come in a trillion short, that's not a cut. We need to have real cuts from what spending has been in the past.
You are serious about wanting to cut the budget. You're serious about wanting to compel the president to operate the government without any borrowing. Not all of your colleagues are, but some of them have said to my colleagues and me here at Fox and elsewhere, particularly Republicans, particularly conservative Republicans, that they will not.
You're fired.
Hello, America. Judge Andrew Napolitano here in for Glenn Beck tonight. The budget cut that wasn't. When you cut a budget in the real world, it means you spend less than you did previously. But in Washington, a long way from reality, you can spend more this year than you did last year and still call it a cut, so long as you cut $38 billion from what the president originally wanted to spend. What's absurd is that some Republicans, like House Speaker John Boehner, are championing this deal as a big budget cut, while big government-loving liberals are attacking the deal as a blow to their beloved social spending programs. How are both sides so blind to the fiscal reality? It's not a cut. It's a shell game. The government is spending billions more this year in 2011 than it did last year in 2010, and it's borrowing $1 trillion between now and October just to make ends meet. And while the Congress can't find a way to make real cuts, its members are gearing up to vote yes on raising the debt ceiling. It seems the Congress only knows how to borrow and spend money more each year and not how to cut and spend. Freshman Congressman Justin Amash from Michigan joins me now. Congressman Amash, welcome to the Glenn Beck program.
Thanks for having me on, Judge.
Of course. Why can't the president operate the government without borrowing more money than he collects in taxes and other revenue?
Well, we have a people who become too dependent on welfare, too dependent on spending. We have a military budget difference in strategy. A lot of my colleagues believe that the strategy is to make the big battle over the debt ceiling, over the 2012 budget. I think we need to fight right now, and that's what I'm doing. The cuts we've seen so far have been tiny. We have this $38 billion deal that supposedly is the largest cut in the history of the country, and during the time we're debating this deal, the deficit increased enough to make up for the cuts.
Right.
I mean, it surpasses the cuts that we made just in the time we negotiated it.
Congressman, I don't think that this is a cut at all. This is really a reduction from what the president planned to spend. This is not any actual savings. In order for the government to do what Congressman Boehner and the president and Senator Reid have agreed to do, it's got to borrow another $1 trillion.
It continues to grow, and we have an entitlement problem in this country. Our Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are growing out of control, and we need to reform that for the generations coming up, or we're not going to be able to sustain this country.
Now, when the Democrats controlled the Congress last year, both houses of Congress, they were unable to come up with a budget for this full year, which is why we're 4 months into 2011, but 6 months into the fiscal year, and we don't have a budget for the rest of the year. Each time one of these continuing resolutions has come up, 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there, 5 days there, you have voted against them. I suspect it's because you believe that this is no way to run any kind of a business, much less the largest in the world, the federal government of the United States. What do your fellow Republicans say to you when you keep voting against these efforts to kick the can down the road?
Well, there appears to be a